All right, so we have pretty much everything rolling now.
I feel a little dirty though.
Why?
Well, we've been going through all this, and I've talked about, and you talked about, we got a directive, we got a filter, we got a service.
Yeah.
How the heck do I know which one I'm supposed to be using?
Well, my suggestion, and actually Pascal Prex, the author of the module, suggests to go with the directive as much as you can.
The directive.
The directive. So let's look at that one more time too. So
So we have two ways to do an HTML, directive or filter.
Yep.
And then you have one way in the code, service.
Yes. So right here on lines 41 through 45 is a good example of all of them together. The suggestion is to use the directive as much as possible. The reason for that is it's intelligent enough to know to unwatch when it's not going to change anymore, kind of thing.
Oh, so it creates an additional watcher for the language translation, but then it unwatches when it's not supposed to?
Correct.
Interesting.
With the filter, though, it's not intelligent enough to do that. So you're going to be adding watches to it, adding watchers to your Angular app, and that'll, over time increase, thinking about all the different areas you're going to be translating inside your application, right?
I'm assuming that means that the filter is going to be evaluating more often,
Yes.
which means it's doing more translations needlessly because you're not going to change the word for age 100 times, right?
Right. So, and as you know, a big thing with Angular is as the watchers increase, the performance might degrade or will degrade over time as that increases, right? So,
all right, so let's nix the filter
steer
idea.
away from the filter.
But why would I use a directive with, I see there in line 41, you got a directive which just says translate, and it uses the value from the element. And the one right below it, using translate, where you're just hard coding in the value.
Right.
Why would I use one key versus the other?
There really is no reason why. It's just based on preference what you would like to do with that.
Okay, and if I, on line 42, if I took out last name on the right-hand side, inside the element, does that operate any differently than what you just had?
No.
Okay, so will this show a default value of the word last underscore name if we can't figure it out still? It'll still use the key?
No, it'll show the language, the translation ID key.
Okay,
that we see.
so that's probably the right way to do it, right? You wouldn't say last name, like you had.
Like this? Oh, sorry.
Like that. Would
Yeah,
you do
that's
this,
fine.
or would you do the other way? Which one do you recommend?
I would actually, you're right. I would prefer doing it, or I would recommend doing it that way, since
Okay.
there's already that text there, and in case the translation ID does fail to load or it's not found, it'll show that text at least.
All right. So we would get rid of the filter. Really keep it in there for now just as an example. What about the other options? So you're saying, John, use a directive, but when do I use a service?
So the service is when you don't necessarily have access to that translation ID in the view itself,
Okay.
and you only really have access to it in code.
So we did that in one place, right?
Right here in the dashboard controller.
Because those are, well, we could have had toast elements, but the toaster is actually something that's written by a third party.
Yep.
So we didn't have access to the HTML. We could always override it, but
Yeah, you could do that. But since we're passing in that information into the toaster, we'll pass in the already translated data into it. Otherwise, we would have to go into toaster and modify that and update it to adhere to Angular Translate's syntax and stuff like that.
okay, what if I had like a large list of translations? Let's say that I, in this application, I wanted to have some kind of a, I go to HTTP, I get a bunch of data, and it's like a list of things. Let's say it's a list of food. Maybe I'm making a menu.
Yeah.
And it could be one row or it could be 20 rows. And that data is going to come back, and I'm not actually going to put it on the screen and maybe do a modal dialogue or something like that. If I was going to do translations like that, would a service be good in that case, or would it be good to create a directive with the HTML, or how would you go?
I would say create the directive with HTML.
Okay. So the directive is going to operate most efficiently, but the service is kind of like when all else fails?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I think in order of preference, it would go the directive as much as you can. In the areas where you don't have access to do that, go with the service. And then last but not least, the filter. But
Or never the filter.
Or never really, yeah.
Okay. All right, so that makes sense. And we've pretty much architected this the way we like, mostly directives. We just use one filter as an example.
Yep.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the other thing I felt dirty about is back in the app. Can we look at that?
Sure.
You've been ignoring this, and it's bothering me. What is this? Pascal Prex says you're not sanitized.
So that's a security measure that he has built into the library now to help escape the content that's going into the translations. So all we really need to do for that is add one little bit of code.
Why could this bite me?
Well, if somebody injects malicious code into the translations by any chance, you can, and it's not being properly escaped, then that code will get to execute within the context of that.
In our case, our translations are hard-coded, so that wouldn't happen. But are you
Right.
saying like if there was like an input box or something, and then we use that to translate?
That, or maybe if you're loading your language files from another resource.
Ah, from another location.
Yeah.
So if the things you're translating, the keys, I'm assuming, because that's what we're really pushing into the translate service, right?
Yeah.
If the keys had some kind of malicious content in them, this sanitizing would
Correct, yeah.
pull that out. Okay.
So that's what this is doing.
All right. Save us. Make us safe.
Sure. So to do that, we're going to go back to the config here. And we will bring up the translate provider again. And it says use sanitization strategy, I believe. Sanitization strategy.
There are way too many words in all these things.
Yeah,
Use
I always forget
sanitization. Use sanitize.
Unisanitize.
I'm going to Google it. Use sanitize value strategy
That's it.
thing. Doohickey.
By default, this goes in as null. But what we're going to really want to do is just say sanitize.
You know, I can't really make fun of him too much because I'm the guy who does a readable code presentation and talk about use very descriptive functions. So I like the long function name. It's just IntelliSense would help, right?
Yeah.
And that's where, again, TypeScript would be cool.
Yep. So now that that's in place, we should no longer see that message in console, as you can see here.
Awesome. So the sanitization value strategy is sanitize.
Yep.
Okay. Well, that was an easy fix. Is there anything else, like as far as tidying up the app, that we should be doing to kind of move things along?
Well, one thing we could do is we can, right now is what we're doing is we're pre-packaging the app with all our translation tables.
Okay.
But really this isn't fun to do, and to have this much code in one file, it's just ugly looking.
It's awful, honestly.
So we can break these out into separate files and then load those files into the Angular Translate module.
Okay. How about next we show me how to do that?
Sure.